With that said, I'm now going to move on to introducing our three incredible panelists for today. Sara Duvisac is a research and policy advisor at Oxfam America and a Mellon American Council of Learned Societies public fellow. Her research areas span migration and gender, care work, precarious work, decolonizing aid, and housing rights. She has published her research in academic and popular journals and holds a PhD in sociology from New York University. We also have Dr. Luis Eduardo Zavala de Albas, who is the founder and director of Casa Monarca, Ayuda Humanitaria al Migrante ABP, a migrant shelter based in Monterrey, Mexico, to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people while defending their human rights. He has been a visiting fellow at the Council for Latino American and Iberian Studies at Yale University, a research fellow at Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. Dr. Zavala holds a PhD in international law from the Gregorian University and a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Essex. And we're really grateful that he could join us today. And last, it's my pleasure to introduce Irena Sullivan, who is the Senior Immigration Policy Counsel at the Tahirih Justice Center, where she advocates for laws and policies that promote access to safety and justice for survivors of gender-based violence. As Tahirih's first Director of Legal Services back in 1998, she represented people fleeing abuses such as forced marriage, rape, domestic violence, human trafficking, and female genital mutilation or cutting. Irena has also served as the Associate Counsel for the Refugee and Asylum Law Division at USCIS and as Director of the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration. So thank you all for being with us today. And I also want to shout out our other colleagues at Oxfam, Sara Tuckey and Mark. Everyone has been fantastic, and we're just grateful for everyone's work on getting this incredible report out into the world. And so without further ado, I will start with our first panelist, Sara. Would love if you could give us an overview of the foundations of this research and share some of the key findings that this research uncovered.
Thanks, Casey, and good morning, everyone. We're very excited to share this report with you. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the methodology and our approach to this research. Next slide, please. So we employed a feminist research framework, and for us, first and foremost, that meant that we wanted to ensure that conducting this research didn't harm or re-traumatize any survivors of gender-based violence. And so we made the decision to interview providers who serve survivors and migrants and not survivors themselves. And second, we wanted to ensure that the rights of participants were at the very center of our research. And for us, this meant that participants, that is providers, social service and legal service providers, had the right to terminate their participation in our research at any time. They had the right to review any full quotes that we used in our report. And they also remained anonymous within the report. And in terms of dissemination of our work, a select number of participants were given an early draft of the report and were invited to provide feedback. And the final report was shared with everyone who participated in the research, and participants were given both English and Spanish versions of the report. The data collection happened both in English and in Spanish, and our data is based on 30 interviews, 34 survey responses. And in terms of the providers that we interviewed and surveyed, we wanted to ensure geographic diversity so that our results weren't being driven by dynamics within specific regions. So now I'll move on to talking about some of our key findings. The main argument of the report is that deterrence-driven U.S. asylum policies harm and marginalize women, girls, and LGBTQI+ migrants, including survivors of gender-based violence, as they seek safe haven in the U.S. And by deterrence policies, we mean any type of U.S. asylum policies that aim to limit or deter asylum seekers from reaching U.S. borders or entering U.S. borders. And we find that this happens in two ways. One, that policies of border closure and expulsion create conditions that increase the risk of gender-based violence for migrants and asylum seekers at the US southern border. And second, we find that US policies themselves re-traumatize and disadvantage survivors of gender-based violence who are able to apply for relief. And so we argue that these policies, we argue and show that these policies normalize gender-based violence as an inevitable consequence of seeking asylum in the US. Next slide, please. And so to go into the details of the impact of border closures and expulsions, and our research really looks at the impact of Title 42, Remain in Mexico, and former metering program. So we find that they create conditions that increase the risk of gender-based violence through three mechanisms. One is through the proliferation of precarious housing conditions. And we mean shelters that are overcrowded and stretched at capacity, informal encampments, and homelessness, which have all increased because of prolonged wait times at the border and because of increased expulsions. And these are sites of huge rates of gender-based violence. So our interview respondents, 60% noted that their clients had experienced some form of violence within shelters themselves. And because of the ways in which the shelter system has been stretched out, abusers are not removed. There's difficulty in ensuring safety of women, girls, and LGBTQI individuals. Second, we find that these policies of border closures and expulsions make migrants clear targets of cartels and organized crime. So of course, certain regions in Mexico do have cartel violence, but what we examine are the ways in which these specific types of US asylum policies really make migrants vulnerable to cartel violence. And we look at three different ways. One is that often expulsions can happen in ways in which cartels know how to target migrants who are being expelled. Second, because of the poor housing conditions and precarious housing conditions, they've also become a site in which cartels surveil migrants and make them vulnerable to extortion, kidnapping, and sexual violence. And lastly, we find that the economic vulnerability that's associated with prolonged wait times, particularly for women and LGBTQI+ migrants, also make them vulnerable to cartel violence. This is often as they travel long distances seeking employment or going to work. And lastly, we also find that prolonged wait times for asylum seekers have made them easier targets of their abusers who find them and reharm them at the border. And about 25% of our interview respondents noted that their clients had faced this kind of harm. And in general, we find that there's very high rates of gender-based violence at the border. So for example, 68% of our survey respondents indicated that their clients had been raped or sexually assaulted specifically at the border. Next slide, please. And these risks are compounded for Black and LGBTQI+ migrants. We find that a huge proportion of migrants are targeted for violence because of their sexual orientation or non-cisgender identity while at the border. And second, we find that Black migrants, because of the ways that they face racial discrimination within the US asylum system, are subjected to further anti-Black discrimination and violence at the border. And next slide, please. So moving from policies and how they impact migrants and asylum seekers at the border, our research then looks at the ways in which the US asylum system systematically harms survivors of gender-based violence. And we look at three different ways that this happens. The first is through the behavior of CBP officials who we find systematically deter and demean survivors of gender-based violence while enacting from a paradigm of deterrence rather than supporting asylum seekers. So 65% of our survey respondents indicated that their clients had been expelled or turned back frequently from the US because CBP officials had not followed required procedures. And so we have countless stories from providers of survivors of gender-based violence who were laughed at, who weren't allowed to claim asylum, and generally just deterred from entering the US by CBP officials. Next slide, please. And second, we find that the asylum system is an adversarial one rather than a trauma-informed one, and this specifically disadvantages and re-traumatizes gender-based violence survivors. And this really happens through the fact that many survivors of violence, because of the trauma that they've experienced, have immense difficulty in recounting their stories of violence. And there's no mental health support given to survivors to be able to recount these stories. And this can create difficulties even in in expressing that they've been survivors of violence. It can create inconsistencies in timelines, which then are used to kind of grill and harass verbally survivors who are retelling their stories, which often re-traumatizes them. And this is compounded by a lack of language services, which makes it very difficult for survivors to, again, give evidence and retell their stories. And the issue of credibility for survivors has gender and racial dynamics. So for example, providers note that often Black survivors are deemed as less credible by immigration officials and judges, and that survivors who identify as women face immense trauma when they have to recount their stories to cis male immigration officials and judges, and also that many survivors who faced violence at the hands of police or armed forces or paramilitary groups in their home countries find it incredibly traumatic to have to recount their stories to CBP officials who in their clothing remind them of the perpetrators of their own harm. Next slide, please. And lastly, we find that the US legal framework for asylum in itself inherently disadvantages survivors of gender-based violence. So 62% of our survey respondents noted that survivors frequently or very frequently do not apply for asylum because of a lack of familiarity with the complexities of US asylum law. So what we find is that survivors have immense difficulty in building a narrative around gender-based violence in the asylum application because gender and gender-based violence aren't mentioned as explicit grounds for asylum in US law. This means that survivors may not know to recount these stories in their application. They are sometimes told to use it as a secondary basis for asylum claim. And lastly, because of norms around violence, many may not also see their experience of gender-based violence as violence itself and may not share it. Second, providers noted of immense difficulties in utilizing the particular social ground as a ground for asylum for survivors of gender-based violence. And this is often one of the few avenues for survivors of gender-based violence to apply for asylum. And providers noted to us that for many cases, this is not a successful strategy. And then these barriers are compounded by the fact that there's a lack of legal representation, which survivors particularly need in able to navigate this complex system and to successfully apply for asylum. So in these ways that we find that for survivors of gender-based violence, the US asylum system, when they apply, creates significant harm and re-traumatization. And for those who are most at risk for gender-based violence, particularly women, girls, and LGBTQI+ migrants, waiting at the border faces immense risks that are directly tied to the impact of US deterrence policies of border closure and expulsion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. Zavala to tell us more about what these findings actually look like on the ground in the lives of survivors that you are working with and serving? And in what ways do these deterrence policies, remain in Mexico and Title 42, just as examples, increase the vulnerability of the folks that you're working with day to day?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me in this amazing webinar among amazing women committed with other women on what we understand right now, almost like a crime against humanity, gender-based violence. And I want to focus on context. Can you see my presentation? Okay, because I've just ended up this morning a meeting, an interview, because we're part of the civil society unity on United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. Last week, we participated on the 11th conference of the Convention against UN Convention against International Organized Crime. And as a civil society involved in the field, dealing with human trafficking and smuggling is linked, related, certainly with gender-based violence. We cannot talk on gender-based violence because not only is part of the obligation coming from authority, from the state, but as well, we're facing, and we've heard this in our shelter, as you mentioned, Casey, we are, in our mission is to welcome, to protect, defending human rights of women, defending from gender-based violence, to promote, and to integrate and defend the human rights of migrant refugees and internally displaced people. And that framework, we've got a mission, a vision as well as an organization. We are actually giving a local response to a global phenomenon and human kind of defense, trying to humanize migration on a very inhuman situation that it happened in many shelters through the very dangerous journey of women through Mexico. As you might know, Mexico is not only a city of destiny now, or it's as well a city of country of transit. And because of that, we need to focus on these two situations on actually under international law, which is actually human trafficking and smuggling. We're thinking about the record-breaking nature of the nearly 2.4 million encounters of the U.S.-Mexico border in fiscal year 2022, overlook the much bigger story than actually figures in the U.S. Migrants and asylum seekers flows have become increasingly atmospheric in nature, and as a result, U.S. enforcement policies long directed toward arrival from Mexico and northern Central America. That is actually misleading, and we need to think about this situation that will linked to human smuggling and human trafficking. We're talking about in the U.S. more than 35 billion worldwide. I mean, 3 people per day having this situation that the price paid to human smuggling from $4,000 even to $12,000 by boat, by train, by the small groups in which they are actually transiting Mexico. We're talking about a big business of human smuggling. Think about a huge amount of money coming from the criminal gangs and traffickers. Because this is a business, we realize it's important to think about in the framework of these two protocols of the United Nations, a Convention Against International Organized Crime, the one from smuggling, the one from trafficking. So even if this is a presentation that I've just read up, but it has been increasing in the last couple of years. We're talking about kidnapping from Matamoros and Reynosa and Coahuila that has been increasing in the last 3 years, certainly. And the rescue that the Migration National Institute, that's the name of the Mexican government dealing with migration. It's been already mentioned, but in many areas, as a part of the former advisor of the Citizen Council of National Migration Institute, we're thinking about not only change the narrative, because what we've heard from the migration national issues about rescuing migrants and refugees, while at the same time we have an increasing number of kidnapping and smuggling, and at the same time thinking the detention centers and different kind of detention centers. What we believe, at least from now, the increasing number of the what I already mentioned, we are focused right now on what we call this is humanitarian crisis, but that is not even the number of people detained on the detention center, but the causes that motivate forced migration, the way in which migration are carried out, the problems migrants face along the way, and the perception of migrants as a merchandise, and of course, the inability of the state to act to promote or to protect human rights of migrants and refugees, particularly because that increases the gender-based violence. So we think about, we're dealing on this humanitarian crisis, and it's going to be certainly a huge issue when we talk about how deal with migrants, women under this constantly gender-based violence. We need to think of this as a humanitarian crisis. We need to think about this in how human rights is going to be exactly through a gender-based approach to protect migrants from this international human rights framework. As I mentioned, migrants are used as a merchandise for buying, selling, and exchanging, for traffic, smuggling, extortion, recruitment, sales of organs, generating, of course, repetitive actions, brutal detention, which we all often find gender-based violence, abuse and extortion, corruption, lack of justice, and high level of impunity. What we recommend, or what we're working now since we've been trying to get into this situation with the government and the dialogue on a high level with the immigration national issues about the lack of legal control, how they still had to deal with the human traffickers and smugglers, and this politics of contention from the federal government that sometimes, of course, it's increases the migrants and refugees looking for a better life, to look for the participation in one way or another, but at the same time to look for a better life, even paying to the human traffickers. And this is such a tragedy. We have seen the human consequences of migration is exactly the main problem. And for instance, what we heard from Estela, all the risks that you hear about are true, about the worst thing of it all is the one person is killed, one has disappeared, and nobody notices. That is the worst part of this story that we've heard in our shelter on a daily basis. I had a friend who came over but had not been heard for 1 month, then another one, still nothing. They found him lying in the morgue and had been killed only because they had not been able to pay the cartels in full. This is the statement of Estela a couple of months ago. And what we have to do, or what we're trying to do, is first of all to recognize that this is a particular gender-based violence approach under the human rights framework what we need to look at, and we need to provide and to encourage the states to implement public policies. We're not going to stop gender-based violence until we focus not only into the international human rights obligation coming from the Mexican state, but as well under the UN Convention of International Organized Crime. When we think about the obligation of the Mexican state and how to deal with these two issues, we need to think about how the shelter are going to welcome particular focus on women, how we're going to protect all these women, and giving in one way or another all the attention that they may need, particularly psychosocial attention that we've had. We recently had a woman raped by 7 migrants in the trains that we protected and tried to help. And she stayed with us almost 3 months because it was quite difficult to prepare and trying to understand the context in which she suffered all this kind of gender-based violence, and how to increase the kind of help in order to make them to make her feel much better throughout the psychologists and social workers in the shelter. We need to promote, and we need to, at the end of this process, to integrate migrants and refugees. And what we include on these local shelters, first of all, well, we welcome, we need to look at this excellent report. It mentioned the safe routes, the legal routes, the violation, where we find these issues on the process, the lack of mechanisms to protect through rights and dignity. Of course, the lack of human development and contribution that we're trying to integrate at the end, culturally, socially, and of course, the knowledge about migrants on transit in Mexico. As a civil society actively involved in through safer legal routes with the defense, of course, and human rights and dignity, and a local level guaranteeing one way or another, as well coming from the international legal obligation, these are of issues. But one of the things, it's important, migrants still are invisible when the human rights are denied, but visible when they're being hurt. They migrate because of lack of economic resources, because of the financial resources, but as well because of the organized crime. And we all know what happened in Central America. We all know what is increasing number of human traffickers and smugglers in Mexico. So we need to think about how they are accepted when they're able to contribute, but rejected if they ask for a public spiritual help, particularly when they have suffered gender-based violence. They are needed for some low-status job or rejected for not being qualified. People pity them because of their journey condition, but few states are ready to shelter them. States seek to keep the refugees because they represent this migrant group and can choose whom to grant refugees. We've got 85,000 applications for refugee status in Mexico, but they have 1,000 of migrants on transit looking to reach the U.S. border. When in that kind of period they suffer throughout the journey to the U.S. So what is important at this stage is what we're doing through this report and thinking about on the most important outcome of this report. It's a kind of evidence based on the testimony of many women that have suffered this kind of gender violence. But we need to look at, well, what kind of human response we're doing, what kind of human fraternal and fair response to migrants and refugees on this stage when we think about how to defend their rights and how to defend, of course, against smugglers and traffickers. I would end it up here, and we'll be time to debate on later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those insights, Dr. Zavala. And thank you again for being with us today, knowing just how busy you are, where you are. It's clear that the push factors from countries of origin are intersecting with U.S. deterrence policies to create incredibly desperate situations along our border, and that this is putting already traumatized survivors at even greater risk. And at this point, folks, just expect that gender-based violence, sexual assault, domestic violence is an inevitable part of migration towards the United States. And that's truly heartbreaking. But this isn't how it has to be, and it is the result of policies that can and should change. And so now I would like to turn it to Irena. And after hearing from Sara and Dr. Zavala, I wonder if you can share with us, what are some of the solutions to the problems identified in the report? What policy recommendations do you think are key to addressing the critical issues we as service providers and advocates have long known existed and that continue to cause tremendous harm, but are once again in the spotlight because of this report?
Great, thank you so much. Yes, so I think I wanted to start by saying, you know, none of the ideas we present here for policy recommendations are cure-alls. You know, it helps me to remind myself of that. Nothing is a perfect fix. We're just talking about steps toward hopefully someday implementing a paradigm that is more rooted in compassion, equity, and the premise that seeking asylum is a legal right and not a criminal act. And so this is our hope for the US approach to the asylum process. And here are some steps. We have specific and broad steps. We have steps or recommendations that could help in the near term as well as the long term. And ideas for both Congress and the administration to implement. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, we are advocating for discontinuing the use of deterrence policies as a paradigm that are designed to penalize and punish migration. And we feel that abandoning this model will help mitigate those conditions that Sara talked about that foster widespread gender-based violence in Mexico at the US border. And abandoning this paradigm will also help to mitigate re-traumatization of asylum seekers by US officials when they do make it through to seek asylum. Next slide, please. So abandoning the deterrence model would need to be replaced by a new model. And so we are advocating for replacing it with a service-oriented model. And this would involve welcome centers for asylum seekers where they can access resources, referrals to legal and social services, translated into their native languages, mental health, physical, medical services, that kind of thing. And also, very importantly, case management services. This benefits all stakeholders so that people know what they're doing, what they need to do for their case. It reduces a lot of government waste on the front end and the back end. And the Welcome Center model would be also trauma informed. And this, it would again be a non-punitive model and one rooted in compassion, and it would also promote accountability, and it would reduce harm from racial and gender bias to have these welcome centers with this model. This is already happening. It's important to point out this is already happening in various places and contexts in our country, but a more coordinated and well-funded, sustainable type of model is what we're advocating. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little time on what we mean when we say trauma-informed policies and practices. So that we talk about services being victim or survivor centered. And what this really translates to is compassionate services, non-judgmental, and avoiding re-traumatizing. Examples of ways of avoiding re-traumatizing individuals is allowing them enough time to process trauma and secure mental health services and be able to find counsel. So trauma is could be acute, it could be chronic. Someone could be in a state of post-traumatic stress all the time, and so that they're a trigger away from fight, flight, or freeze at any time. And this reality is really what requires survivors to have the time to process the trauma and be able to present their cases effectively. Also, as Sara touched on, this idea that credibility assessments need to account for how post-traumatic stress manifests. So different standards apply when someone has experienced trauma. It's not the same as someone who, you might interpret them as being not credible, or if they're traumatized, they might exhibit certain symptoms, certain reactions that might mean that they are in fact credible, but their trauma is manifesting in different ways. And examples of like timelines not being consistent, certain details left out, blocking events out, that sort of thing. And finally, tying back to the theme of the normalization of gender-based violence, particularly for survivors themselves, when we treat women and girls who arrive as asylum seekers as automatically as derivatives, we are actually strengthening that normalization for them and for perpetrators. That gender-based violence is just what happens to you, and that we need to start really being aware of how we're treating women and girls who arrive, who are in search of protection. We need to treat them as principal applicants, just like any other. Next slide, please. And again, this is for Congress and the administration. We need to fully implement trauma-informed training within all US agencies that interface with migrants and asylum seekers. It's one thing to have policies on the books, which we do, but implementation is only as effective as those who are implementing those policies. And so there needs to be meaningful implementation and accountability when trauma-informed trainings are not followed. And to that end, I think that having those trainings be co-developed and co-delivered with outside experts including those who are most directly impacted, which would be survivors of gender-based violence themselves, in a non-re-traumatizing manner. That's the devil in the details, but I think that presenting trainings to those who do not have a frame of reference for working with traumatized individuals, it's very important to include among the trainers themselves is survivors. Next slide, please. As we've seen, as Sara pointed out, we need to focus on Border Patrol in particular. There needs to be robust accountability measures for lack of compliance with trauma-informed training, perhaps including in performance evaluation criteria, compliance with the training. Hiring criteria needs to be revisited for Border Patrol officials. There needs to be independent monitoring, as we've seen over and over, particularly in light of, as we know, the Facebook group and many other examples with Border Patrol. One of the things that came out of that investigation was that trainings were not taken seriously. They were sort of laughed at and dismissed. And so again, getting back to this point of trainings being delivered by survivors, that would go toward that goal of making officials actually take the training seriously. Also, complaint process information for those who have been harmed needs to be readily available to migrants, and that will send the message that we take those complaints seriously, and also the message that retaliation for filing complaints is not to be tolerated. Next slide, please. Similarly, we're advocating for eradication of racial bias. Again, this is for Congress and the administration. The DHS Equity Action Plan needs to be fully implemented, Department of State, other agencies as well, within all components of the agencies that interface with migrants. Again, it bears repeating, training co-developed and co-presented with outside experts, including those most directly impacted by racial bias. And again, particular focus on Border Patrol, hiring criteria, and through legislation, regulations, policy, performance evaluation criteria can be addressed, and independent monitoring is critical, and complaint processes available, information readily available as well. Next slide, please. And as Sara mentioned, with survivors who are able to come and apply for asylum, or who try to apply for asylum, there is really no way that if you're unrepresented, which is the majority of survivors at the border, that you really have any way of knowing that you are eligible for asylum on account of gender. And this again is a reflection and manifestation of the normalization of gender-based violence for survivors themselves. If you look at the asylum form, there's no mention of gender. And so what we are advocating is statutorily an amendment to add a sixth ground for asylum of sex or gender. Also naming sex and gender as cognizable particular social groups in the statute, and also through regulations, which is where gender could be named as an example of a particular social group. And along those lines, the asylum application should actually name gender as a ground of asylum, whether a particular social group and or as a sixth ground in and of itself, and also list examples of gender-based violence right there in the application, again, to counter the normalization of this experience of gender-based violence for applicants. So list explicitly, gender-based violence includes domestic violence, forced marriage, etc. So people are aware and on notice. Next slide, please. We also advocate in the report alternative pathways. We're seeing incredible amounts of danger for people who are fleeing en route to the US. And so the Refugee Protection Act is critical to address this. It has a provision for the Central American Refugee Program, Refugees of Special Humanitarian Concern, which is specifically designed for survivors of gender-based violence. And so this would be another critical pathway for survivors to apply for relief where they are. And of course, again, implementation is critical, trauma-informed implementation, and there needs to be independent oversight of this process of applying, and safety of survivors needs to be ensured while they're waiting for processing. Okay, and finally, foreign policy. We advocate for aligning immigration and asylum policies with our foreign policy goals, which they are not in alignment right now. Our foreign policy goals include reduction of gender-based violence and promoting economic and social empowerment for women and LGBTQIA+ people. And currently our policies of deterrence, and particularly the consequences, as Sara noted, of exacerbating these conditions that increase gender-based violence, cause it to proliferate, are completely out of step with our foreign policy goals. So we need to align the two. And also ensuring that bilateral migration agreements include commitments to ensure safe and secure journeys, particularly for those most vulnerable to gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Irena. That was incredibly useful summary of the detailed policy recommendations that can be found in the report itself. I would love to take the last 10 minutes to ask a few more questions of our panelists. And I do see the question from the audience. I'm grateful for that. And I'm going to give Irena a quick break before we turn back to her with the question about case management, and turn back to Sara quickly and ask if you might share, were there any limitations or challenges that we faced when conducting this research?
I think in answering that question, to talk about maybe one of the strengths of why we chose this more qualitative approach is that it, particularly doing interviews such as these, helps us understand these really complex.
I'm going to give Sara a second to unfreeze.
Audience. And we wanted to understand specifically how US policies are shaping those dynamics and what role US policies play. And really a qualitative approach allows us to get into those nitty-gritty dynamics as our research report lays out. But the limitation in that approach is really quantifying the prevalence of that harm, right? And in general, I think quantifying prevalence of gender-based violence is a real challenge. And so what our report shows is that it's really widespread, and we use our surveys to be able to expound on that and what types of violence are widespread. But giving a specific number, X percentage of migrants face this, our report can't do that. And I think in general, it's really hard to be able to give those numbers.
Thank you, Sara. Yes, I think the prevalence question is always a really challenging one, despite all the other kinds of evidence that we have. So I think this report brings a really powerful argument to the table in response to that. So I will turn back to Irena, because the question came up during your presentation around, the welcome centers and the services that would be available at the welcome centers through this proposed model, and in particular, what the US government's role in case management could look like or should look like.
Thank you for that question. So currently, there's a DHS case management pilot program, and there's a national board, and they coordinate with local nonprofits for providing referrals for mental health services, screenings for human trafficking, legal orientation, cultural orientation, connecting to social services, and departure planning and integration services. And so it remains to be seen where this model will go and how this will really work to the benefit of asylum seekers. So I think it's, as far as the government's role, it's really hard to say without seeing this pilot project through, because it's obviously government run. And so it will have to be, it will have to play out before we're really able to see whether or not this model is the model to go with. But I think it's safe to say, regardless, the sort of patchwork of efforts that is going on right now among community-based organizations is not sustainable given the numbers that we're seeing of people needing to flee. And so inevitably, it's going to come down to funding a more coordinated response. So those two things might be in tension with each other, but we'll have to see down the road.
Thank you, Irena. That was really, really helpful. And then in the last couple of minutes, I would love to turn back to Dr. Zavala and ask, we've talked a lot about what the US government can and should do, but I think in your first remarks, you already touched on a little bit about the ways in which, the situation on the ground in Mexico and the policies in the United States are intersecting to create this situation. And so there's so much, we can do in the United States to change policies. But what do you see as sort of the role of the government of Mexico to support improving this system?
Well, first of all, I would like to just stress that we all agreed on fundamental motive behind this report, that is translate these ideas into action. So we all agreed as well that it's important to think about how to implement the public policy. And one thing is true, we need to this, or the only way to do this is to collaborate and to increase the diplomatic channels, the high level political dialogue, not only thinking about migrants or pawns on this political situation we're dealing with. There's a lot of lack of misunderstanding in the US, a highly politicized issue in the US regarding migrants and refugees. So we all agree to educate people in the US, but as well in Mexico, we need to think about to the Mexican government how to build a public policy regarding not only thinking of migrants on an issue of national security issue, but as well, we need to think very seriously the contention policy of the Mexican government, increase in this administration through the militarization. And we do believe on all the human rights defenders through the 120 shelters around Mexico. We all agreed as well how important it is to dialogue with the government, to increase the capacity, to think about in managerial terms in how to manage this migrant and transit, more than 300,000 migrants on transit in Mexico throughout the years, and in a different condition, mostly under the human trafficking and smugglers. We need to think about if the Mexican government is going to consider this as a national security issue, we need to think about, on that term, we need to build the public policy. We need to look the efficiency and effectiveness of the COMAR, which is the Mexican Commission for Refugees, and increase the budget, thinking about how to increase not only talking about the last report from the director of this agency, 85,000 applications for refugee status, but we all believe that there are more than that, but there's a lack of capacity, but there's a lack of resources. So the Mexican way should invest and look at the next budgetary in the next budget and the budgetary position and the legislative about how to increase the capacity of the COMAR, how to increase the budget, how to build the public policies on every state regarding how to deal. Because remember, when we think about smuggling, it's at federal level. When we think about trafficking, it's a local level. There's a lack of coordination between federal authorities and local authorities. Because of that, there's a lack of efficiency and effectiveness in the implementation of public policy against trafficking and smuggling. And because of that, of course, the increasing situation of gender-based violence. So we need to think about how to train police officers, how to train our forces. You already mentioned how to train as well the capacity of the due process for regularization. We're working with 6 lawyers in the shelter. We would need more people because of the lack of due process for regularization, particularly in Monterrey, for instance, where we are located. There's a deficit, enormous deficit of employment. So we need refugees coming to Monterrey because of the demanding labor force. Because of that, I think we need to build as well, and we're talking about that, how to build a local migration government. Because at the end of the day, it's a local situation for local administrations with federal consequences. We need to think about that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for all of the presenters today. I think I also just want to close by saying, this report is not a report for research sake. It is something that we hope spurs action. I think what can be done and should be done has been known for a long time. And this report is a really clearly re-articulated call to action to do better by the folks who are crossing our borders, in particular survivors of trauma and gender-based violence. And so I hope that this is just the start of a continuing conversation and a call to action on the issues that we've identified in this report. And so I want to thank everyone who's attended today. Again, thank all of our presenters and our colleagues at Oxfam America, especially Sara Tuckey, Michael Helms, and while he's no longer at Oxfam America, he played a major role. Noah Gottschalk was fantastic. And a big shout out also to the Tahirih Justice Center's fellow Rimpal, who has been the tech wizard behind this entire event. And without her, we would not have pulled it off, surely. So thank you so much for all of your hard work behind the scenes. And again, the recording and the slides will be coming to your inboxes sometime next week. And I hope everyone has a great day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.